we will explore some of the basic functions of Photoshop. This is a Level 1 beginner course. If you have never opened this program before, then you are in the right place. Let's start by taking a look at a standard Photoshop document and learn the lay of the land. The white space in the middle is called the canvas. This is the area where the digital paint is applied. On the left, we can see the toolbar, and we'll go into a lot more detail about each individual tool in later lectures. The windows on the right are customizable, but I like having these particular ones visible. They are the Layers window, the History window, the Navigator window, and finally the Color Swatches window. Again, we'll go into detail about the functionality in later lectures. Next, we'll start exploring some basic Photoshop functions. So first I'll show you how to open up a new document just like the one I have here. I've got a canvas set up here, and I'm just going to show you what I've done. Just go to File, New to create a new document. This one is set to do about 14 by 13 inches at 300 dpi. So let's go ahead and hit OK for that. It's a nearly square canvas. Its real life dimensions are 14 by 13 inches. As a good rule of thumb, do 300 dpi resolution and whatever real life dimensions you would like it to be as if it were going to print. So this would look good as a spot illustration for a book page. Any application where it would need to be printed in that actual dimension, just set those dimensions and then do 300 dpi and you should be in good shape. When in doubt, guess more resolution because it's something that you can't add at the end of a project. So we always want to make sure that we start out a project with enough resolution, and this should be perfectly adequate for most needs it will have. Of course, if you were doing an illustration that was going to go on a billboard or some very large format poster illustration, obviously you would need to go higher, but this rule of thumb should hold up. If you keep it at the real world dimensions and at 300 dpi, you should be in good shape. A little bit about tools. The tools that we'll use by far the majority of the time are the brush tool, which I've selected here, the little paintbrush icon, and you can make that larger or smaller with the bracket keys, a very handy keyboard shortcut. And I should mention that B is the keyboard shortcut to select this tool. So I'll hit B and it brings up the brush, and I can make it smaller by hitting the left bracket and larger by hitting the right bracket. Brushes are controlled by opacity and flow. So right now we're at 100% opacity and 100% flow. And that gives us a very bold, full opacity, and I've got black as the selected color here, fully selected black color. Now if we dial back those two, I've gone to 40% opacity and 40% flow. It will be less opaque and it won't be coming out of the brush as fast. So if you do multiple passes with the brush, you can start building up darker and darker tones. I'll dial it back further to do 20 and 20. And you can adjust those with the keyboard just by hitting the number keys, and it will change those by a factor of 10. So 10 you hit 1, 20 you hit 2, 30, 40, 50, and so on. And with flow it's the same thing, you just hold down the shift key. So I'm holding down shift and hitting 5, and now I've got 50% selected. So why don't we do 20 and 20? And by tapping multiple times, doing multiple brush strokes, that's how you can have a lot of control about the way you build up tone. To adjust settings on these brushes, you can hit F5 and it brings up this brush editor menu. And as you can see, Photoshop comes with tons of shapes to choose from just by default. These are a lot of fun to play around with, especially if you're a beginner, but one thing most professionals agree on is that the brush shape and even the settings are not as important as they might seem to be. As long as your techniques are solid, you can do most effects with just about any brush. In fact, The default round brush is what I do the vast majority of my work with. It does the job well. There are tons of settings that we can change here with these jitters, and those are fun to play with. I'll touch on them a little bit here. Let's go back to brush tip shape here. Spacing, if you stretch that way out, it starts reducing the brush to its basic shape. So as you can see, this makes a series of dots. But when we make that spacing tighter, that's what makes it a more continuous line. And obviously, if you go all the way down to 1%, it would be a very solid line. Most of the time, about 25% is adequate. In fact, your computer can start to slow down if your spacing is too tight. But 25% will give you a nice line quality for the most part. Might go a little tighter than that, actually. There we go. Another thing you can do is scattering. Move these shapes off of the midline, kind of scatter them around. That can be a lot of fun, especially if you stretch out your spacing. You can sprinkle these shapes all over your page if you like. And there are tons of these. Just to touch on a few more. Dual brush is a little complicated. I rarely have much use for that, but transfer is fairly useful. You can move the opacity jitter up and the flow jitter, and it randomizes how opaque each of these little dots that is sprayed out is. It can make a nice random effect if you're trying to use this to create some realistic effect like snow or rain, something like that. But for the most part, we're just going to stick with a basic brush that's just making a basic brushstroke line. That's basically all you need to know to get 99% of the kind of work that I do done. So that's just a little bit about the brush tool and its settings. Another tool that I use very often is the smudge tool. And I've got that set as R on my keyboard shortcut, but I think different Photoshop defaults, you may have to reset that one if you want to use it. R is that keyboard shortcut. But this basically just grabs the tone that's already there and kind of smudges it out, as the name suggests. And you can adjust the strength and pressure by hitting the numbers on the keyboard in factors of 10, just like with the brush tool. So I've got this set on 90%. And as you can see, I'm just sort of pulling through this tone here, and it makes a really painterly effect. Especially like how it looks with this particular brush shape that I've got here. And I will make all these brush tip shapes that I use commonly available to you. This is one of the rare circumstances where I think the brush tip shape can have a meaningful effect. So that's what we use the smudge tool for. I will move on to our next topic, will be the use of layers. You can see I've got my layer control panel here on the right side. Right now we've only got one layer, the background layer. We go down to this new layer icon and hit that, and it creates a new layer, layer 1, on top of that. And I've got my brush tool selected here, and I'm just going to make a very basic circle shape. Now, what we can do with this is make another layer underneath, and just to demonstrate the power of layers, I'm going to make another mark underneath. If this was all on the same layer, all of these marks would be merged together and they could not be controlled independently of one another. But because of layers, since I'm selecting this layer beneath, we can move it around underneath this circle that I've drawn. So in that way we can keep these things editable and adjustable as much as we need. And of course, if you get to a point where you like everything the way it is, you can merge those together either by going to Layer, Flatten Image, or if you have them all selected here, you can go to Layer, Merge Layers, or Command E is the keyboard shortcut for that. That'll bring us to our next topic, which is the History panel. This is extremely useful because one of the main advantages of digital art versus traditional art is that no mistake is undoable. Anything that you do that you don't particularly like, you can go back in time, essentially. So let's say I didn't really like this mark I made under. All you have to do is go back to that instance. Whenever that operation is performed, it's recorded in the history panel, and you just go back to it, just like that. And if you want to erase back, essentially put something back the way it was in an earlier state, all you have to do is check this little box next to it. Let's say I check this one before this blue mark was made on the screen. So now that that's checked, I can select the history brush, which is Command Y, or just Y is a keyboard shortcut, and you can actually use this to sort of paint back in time. So it looks like I'm just erasing, but what I'm actually doing is using the history brush to restore this earlier state. So it's a little tough to wrap your head around sometimes, but it's an incredibly powerful tool, especially if you decide that you want to try something kind of risky in your illustration or painting. All you have to do is check the box, and then you can essentially try anything you want. Another similar action is hitting this little camera icon over in the history panel. What that does is create a snapshot. If you scroll all the way up, you can see you've got your beginning state and also the snapshot that we just took. If you check that, then the history brush will erase back to that state. And essentially you can try whatever risky or far out move you want to try, and there's no risk at all because you can always just revert back to this stage altogether, or you can use the history brush to selectively paint back the parts that you want to change. So that's a basic summary of the operations that we'll use. This should cover just about 95%, 99% of everything that we will cover on this website. So once you have these fundamentals mastered, you can come and run with the big dog. So I hope this is helpful, and I think you're going to have a lot of fun in the later demonstrations. Another useful set of Photoshop operations that I'd like to demonstrate are selections. Basically, this is just defining a certain part of your image that we can apply other Photoshop operations to, rather than just applying them universally to the entire page. So I'll demonstrate, and there's a number of ways to create selections. The one that I use most often is the lasso tool, and there are a few different versions of this, but I just use this normal lasso tool, and it just lets you make a shape and it defines a selection. You can tell when something is selected because these marching ant type things happen around the outside edge. So with the lasso tool, we can make pretty much any shape we want, and if you just click again, it'll make a new selection. But if you hold down Shift, you'll see a little plus sign happen to the lasso tool, and we can add to it. We can make more selections or just different shapes. On the other side of that, if you hold down the Option key, you'll see a minus sign appear next to the lasso tool. And with that, we can subtract away from our selection. So this can be useful because I'll make a new layer here. We can paint within these selections, and it won't affect anything else. It's like your, whoops, blocked that by accident. It's sort of like you have an airbrush mask cut or something like that. If you hit Command H, it will hide those marching ants, which I always find kind of useful. They get a little bit distracting. But that's the basic idea. You paint within these selections. I'm going to show you another way. Rather than the lasso tool, you can use the marquee tool. Basically, if you want to make geometric shapes rather than just freehanding it with the lasso tool, you can make rectangles, and I'll here just add in some other ones. You can switch to ellipses, add in a circle. With the circle and the square or rectangular marquee tools. If you hold down Shift, it makes them a perfect circle or a perfect square. Now obviously if you already have a selection and you hold down Shift, it'll just add to it. See the plus sign there. So that only works if it's your first selection. But that's also very useful, and just to demonstrate, we will paint inside of that as well. Now I'm going to try to make this kind of a solid shape, because the next thing I'd like to demonstrate is called command clicking. I'm going to hit Command D, and that is deselect. So now nothing is selected. Just hit undo there. If you want to select all of the pixels that are on a certain layer, you put your cursor over the image of the layer, not the title here, but the image, and you hold down Command, and as you can see, it reselects everything on that layer. I'll create a new layer just to demonstrate that this works on any layer. So if I want to select the pixels on layer 2, Command click layer 2. If I want to select the ones on layer 1, Command click layer 1. And that's a very quick way to navigate your layers and to pull up selections whenever you need them. So that should just about cover our basic Photoshop operations. We know how to set up a basic document. We know how to use the brush tool and the smudge tool. We know about layers and the history panel. And now we know how to make selections and paint within selections. So these fundamentals should help you navigate the later, more complex and certainly more fun lectures